Welcome to Questions of Life. I'm Cath and I'm here with Donald.
Hello.
And we are exploring the whole subject of creation and the role that Christians should play in caring for our world. Enjoy today's session. Now, Donald, we know that we're in the middle of this pandemic, that we are having to wear masks, PPE, lots of different things. And that's fine, and that's something that we have to do. But one of the things that people are commenting on is that a lot of this is one-use plastic. That actually at the moment, as we're trying to save lives and to protect everybody else, we're doing quite a bit of damage to the environment. We're polluting the world even more than we were before. And we know that our world is in a little bit of a mess. And we want to begin to explore that this evening. And if we go back to the beginning of time, if we go back to the beginning as we understand it, and this isn't a scientific explanation, but we believe that in the beginning there was God, and that it was God who created our world. So if you go to the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, it talks about that. It talks about how God lovingly and intricately designed and brought together everything in our world. And as he looked at it, he said, this is good. He was pleased with this. It was kind of like a labor of love. It was something not that he just, we'll throw that together. There you go, get on with it. But we see that God's heart and soul went into our world in creating it. And if we pick up on that whole story of God creating the world, we pick up on the fact that God created the human race. And I want to read just a few words from the Bible to kick us off with, because then you're going to go on and explain that and begin to answer all my many questions this evening. So in Genesis chapter 1, we're starting at verse 27. It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the land. And it then goes on to talk about you've got every seed-bearing plant, everything is there for you to have and for you to look after. But it's interesting phrasing that God uses in that. He talks about this ruling over creation, the planets, everything. What does he mean by that? What does it mean for the human race to rule over the planet? Does that mean that we can just do whatever we want with it?
I think this is something I've thought a lot about over the last maybe 18 months and really tried to grapple with this, because I think my previous perception of the word rule is a sort of dictator, a person who uses things for their own benefit without compassion or care. But actually what the Bible talks about when it talks about the rule of God, the reign of God, it's about having the authority to make decisions out of care and compassion and out of love. So when we talk about God ruling over us, it's in the context of him being our Father. It's a context of care, of having the power to make decisions for the good of someone. So when God says to mankind, to Adam right at the very beginning, this is the first command. The first commandment is to rule over creation. In the second chapter, the word is care, and it's not because it's a contradiction, it's the same idea. It's that we are responsible for looking after the world. We have the authority to make the decisions that are best for planet, best for animals, best for plants. We have to look after them. The authority, the responsibility has been delegated to us. So that rule and reign isn't for our self-interest. It's for the benefit of the creation that we're ruling over, and it's in the name of God. So if you like, one of the words that's used in the Bible is we're either a steward. We're there because God has said, I've made this and it's good, it's beautiful and it's brilliant, and I want you now to look after it. That requires you making decisions, that requires you ordering things, that requires you making sure. If you just let it go, it will not be perfect, not be damaged. So we are given this responsibility to look after the planet and to make decisions for the good of all animals. And that's quite clear in that Genesis. This happens before things have gone wrong. It's after animals have been made. We are to look after them and to not just say, well, they can do what they like.
Yeah.
We're to make sure that everything works together well. So it's a really important commandment, and it's become increasingly important as we have the power to damage the planet far more than any generation has been able to do.
I mean, that was going to be one of my next questions. You know, this has been in here since the beginning. You know, the first thing that God spoke to the human race, this is what we're commanded to do. And yet it's only now that it's really at the forefront of people's thinking. If I go back 10, 20, 30 years, maybe we didn't have the scientific knowledge to know what we were doing. But this wasn't really talked about. This wasn't a huge thing on the agenda of the church or of the world. Is it because we now have more scientific evidence to begin to show us actually we've really stuffed things up, or did we just not care?
I think I'm not an expert in history, but I think that prior to the Industrial Revolution, Christianity did have an understanding of care. So one of the things that's again in the Old Testament is the idea of fields being fallow, of looking after the nutrients of the soil, of looking after animals, that when we were much closer to the land, when most of us were farming or intimately connected to farming, there was a great understanding that part of our duty as followers of God was to care for the land and care for the animals. I think the Industrial Revolution began a separation where we were disconnected from creation, we were disconnected from nature.
Yeah.
So I think we've been through 300 or 400 pretty bad years where we became less aware and less connected to looking after nature. So many of us are just doing jobs where it didn't matter.
Yeah.
And we weren't aware of the pollution or the impact of pollution. We weren't necessarily aware that what we were doing was polluting. I think there was a lot of ignorance. And I suppose in the last... I guess you go back to the midpoint of the last century when people began to see, you know, we began to get rid of steam engines because we could see that they were making buildings dirty, and we could there was the great smog in the 1950s in London where a lot of people died from chest infections. So there was a beginning to understand that we needed to do something more.
Yeah.
I guess the church wasn't at the forefront of that, which perhaps it should have been. And I think more recently, when we've seen a much more global impact, and we can see that what mankind is doing is shaping the planet, I think rightly Christians have begun to become very vocal in saying this is actually a command of ours to look after God's planet and to care for it in that way. So it's certainly true that 20 or 30 years ago, this was less on our radar than it should have been.
But it's becoming increasingly on our radar. I'd still say that perhaps we're a little bit behind the curve in the sense that we're following on in the wake of a lot of other people that have been for some time saying we need to do something about this. But the fact that we are now collectively seeking to do something about it, for me, is really positive and really, really good. But it raises lots of different questions. So as you look at this passage, this whole sense of ruling, I think you're so right in having the right understanding about what that means. And we did a whole session on what is God like, and God is loving and kind and all of these things. And we need to bring that perspective to this passage when we think about it.
Yeah.
And think about the love and the care that God took in creating it.
It's like our dogs.
Yes.
It would be right to say we rule over our dogs.
Well, up to a point.
We train them, we nurture them, we feed them. Every decision that you and I make is for the benefit of our dogs.
Absolutely.
Because we love them. We wouldn't want anything to harm them.
Yeah.
And we know we put them on a lead when we're walking near traffic because it's the safest thing for them. Everything we do is for their care.
Yes.
And I guess that's the picture that a lot of us understand how to look after animals, and we just need to expand that to the whole of nature. It's for but it's for the benefit. It's not in any way intended to be self-centered or corrupt.
Yeah. So the Bible says care for the planet. Now there are different responses to that, aren't there? So there are some Christians that would say, well, it's too little too late, there's nothing we can do. There are some Christians that would say, actually, it doesn't matter. We've been given this sense that we can rule over it. That means we do what we like. And there are some Christians that would say, well, Jesus is coming again. There's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. So if we wear this one out, it doesn't matter because he's going to sort it all out anyway. And then there are some Christians that would say we need to take this seriously and do what we can now. What do you think about those different views and all held within this tension of Christianity?
I do believe that Jesus is going to return.
Yeah.
And when he returns, I want to be doing what he asked me to do. I don't. And one of the stories that Jesus tells is of people waiting for a bridegroom. It's about a festival, and he says, you need to be ready for him to come. And he talks about that some people weren't ready.
Yeah.
And to me, to say we don't need to do what you said, Jesus, because we know you're going to come back and sort it out is a flagrant disobedience of that story that Jesus told. We need to be found when he returns doing what he asked us to do.
Not out of fear.
Not out of fear.
But out of a sense of worship and response to you're so great, I want to do what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would put it this way. I mean, I've got my Meccano. I've got into Meccano in the last few weeks. And this is a little bicycle that I made.
It's good.
If I gave this to you as a present and said, I've worked on this, and you threw it away and trampled on it, I would feel that was a lack of care. I would feel hurt.
Yeah.
I would feel that you didn't value me because you hadn't taken care of something that I had made for you as a gift or a present.
Yeah.
If you said, well, it doesn't matter, next time you're back, you can fix it again.
Yeah.
I think I would say, I don't think I'll give you a present anymore.
Yeah.
I think I would say, I don't think you really care and love what I am about. I don't think you understand me. I think for us to say to God, thanks for your world, we're just going to mess it up, and then you can make a new one, is displaying an unbelievable lack of care and love and understanding of God. I wouldn't want to see his face when I said that to him.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be there at the moment where I said, I'm sorry we've melted all the ice caps and we've killed all the polar bears. They were beautiful, but we didn't want to look after them.
Got some nice photos of them now, haven't we? But we can't,
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be... I just wouldn't want to say that to Jesus. So I don't know when Jesus will return. It could be tonight. It could be another 1,000 years. We really don't know. But I do know that I want to be found doing what he asked of me. He's asked me fundamentally to love my neighbour as myself. If I am to love my neighbour, I am to impart care for their environment that they live in. I'm to make sure that they have enough food to eat. I'm to make sure that they have good oxygen and air to breathe. I'm to make sure that they're not in a land that's too hot or flooding. I'm to make sure, as my love for humanity, that the planet is existing exactly as God intended it to be. Because when God made the world, it was good.
Yeah.
And when it's good, it means it provides the best home, the best environment for mankind. If I damage the planet, I damage humanity. It's like saying, God's made me a house, but I'm going to trash it. That's not a kind thing for the people who live in that house. This world is our home at this moment. We need to look after it because it was made good. And so to love creation and to look after it is a part of loving human beings. It's a part of loving God. It fulfills both the two commandments of God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. How do I love God? I show appreciation for what he's done. How do I show appreciation for what he's done? I look after it. Yeah. How do I love my neighbor? I make sure that they can live safely. I make sure that they are not flooded out or famined out or droughted out or whatever it is. I make sure that the place they live in is a safe place to live in. So to me, it's a no-brainer. So I would be very deeply frustrated with a Christian saying, I don't need to take care of the planet.
So when you're talking about love God, love your neighbour, somebody goes on to ask Jesus, well, who is my neighbour? And you're inferring that we're not just talking about those that are local in our streets. We're talking about anyone and everyone that's in this world, that we are interconnected.
Yes.
That it's not, oh, I just look after myself, Jack's all right. But actually, as a Christian, I have a responsibility to be thinking, okay, how is this not just affecting me and those locally? How is this affecting people globally?
Yeah.
And actually, how is this affecting future generations?
Yeah.
Because like you said, we don't know when Jesus is going to return. And we can't just think, I'm going to trash it now, it doesn't matter. Generations to come after us are going to be like us with slavery.
Yeah.
What on earth were you doing?
Yeah.
Do you think they'll ask that question and think, it's a no-brainer, why didn't you care for the environment?
I think if we don't continue to take the actions that we're campaigning for and we're believing in now, that would have been asked of us. Yes, well, what on earth were you doing? And I think it is the biggest issue where there has been a blind spot. But I think in the last 10, 5, and even 2 or 3 years, most Christians are waking up to this. You might say we were behind the curve, but even some of the voices that have been really pushing on this were people of faith, or people who love God. So we're getting there. I think one of the tricky things, and it goes back to that thing about that you mentioned about the masks, is that in all of this we have to balance a love for creation and a love for mankind. And we're not saying that we can't ever do things that aren't detrimental, but we've got to put it right up. We've got to balance the whole thing. So there is a place for plastic, there is a place for petrol, there is a place for things, but we've got to make sure that as a whole we're offsetting all of that and we're accommodating all of that, and we're not busting the system, the ecosystem, the incredible way God created it. So it's a complex issue, and all of us have got to work out our own personal choices. At what point do we walk? What point do we drive? What point do we fly? How do we do all of those things? There's no easy answers to that, but the point is we've got to get it all balanced, because as a system, there is safeguards in nature to offset things. There is ways of dealing with carbon dioxide, there is ways of dealing with it, but if you mess the system up, then we're in trouble.
Absolutely. So going back to this passage, that we rule over everything, including the animals. If you go on a little bit further into Scripture, there were some early believers that chose not to eat all meats. Some chose not to eat meat at all. And at the moment, it's quite topical that to save the environment, we need to eat less meat, particularly beef and lamb, because they do the most damage to our environment. What's your take on that? Should Christians consider being vegetarians for religious and ecological purposes?
I think there are lots of people who are vegetarian out of faith reasons, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate and understandable viewpoint. I think we might want to say there are 3 possible reasons for being a vegetarian. Maybe vegetarians will give me more, but it is true that it would appear that at the very first part of creation, mankind ate vegetation rather than meat. However, by almost the next part of the Old Testament, certainly through the life of Jesus, he ate meat. So personally, whilst I understand a vegetarian saying this is the way the Bible intended it, I'm not convinced that's exactly why the Bible intended it. I think the second reason that someone doesn't eat meat because of the cruelty to animals and the way animals are handled at the point of death and so on, I think that's a far more convincing reason. So I think that for many Christians, they would just say, I can't have anything to do with the industry of killing animals and the way they do it. Yeah. And I respect that. It's not a choice that I've made myself, but I understand it. Maybe in time I will. I've changed my mind over lots of things, but that's not a decision I've made for myself. I think the third thing which you're alluding to is the amount of the worst resources that are used and needed to provide food for animals that provide food for us. And I think there is an argument there. There's issues about the amount of energy that's used to transport meat around the world. There are issues about the amount of grain that's used. There's issues about the amount of land that is used to grow the grain that is used to grow. There are all kinds of complex issues. I don't think that means we can't have sheep and we can't have cows, but I do think we need to set a boundary. It goes back to this balance, this ecosystem. Therefore, personally, I think that eating less meat and not requiring to eat meat every day is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the types of meat that we eat and being more sensitive to that. Mm-hmm. Again, we're trying to eat meat that is being more carefully, what's the word I'm looking for? Free range kind of stuff where the animals have been more cared for. Again, I think that's a good thing. I think there are some people who economically in the UK can't afford to have that kind of diet. And again, it's all about a balance, and I wouldn't want to create commands and laws, but I think that thinking about how we consume all foods, and meat is a part of it, is part of what we need to do. And just try and be more balanced, and try to, by the way we consume, we influence the people who produce what we consume. So the more we consume local produce, the more we consume free-range produce, the more we consume organic produce, the less we consume processed or meat or whatever, the more we tailor the providers to meet what we want, and that's a good thing.
So it's about us not just going along with the status quo and just doing what we've always done, but beginning to think about these things, beginning to say, okay, we have a world out there that is messed up. I can't change it all, but I can change my little bit of the world, and I can begin to do that. And so it is as simple as maybe looking at some of the things that we buy and some of the things that we do.
Yeah.
And I think you're so right, looking at the actual food that we buy. Where do we buy it from? Is it shipped in from overseas? Can we start growing our own? Can we buy locally? Can we invest in ethical farms, different places around, that actually we are giving money back into the community, into those that I think possibly need it more than the supermarkets do, but that might be a little bit more expensive, so we recognise that. But it's about switching our minds onto this whole thing and beginning to think about it rather than just doing what we've always done.
Yeah, and I think another huge area for me is the amount of food we throw away, and whether the same amount of food can last 2 days instead of one meal and then left at the back of the fridge and then forgotten about, or we buy it and we don't use it and it's gone off, it's gone mouldy.
Yeah.
So there are all, I mean, the figures of the wastage of food are horrendous. So again, it's just being more committed to eating what we've bought and buying less sometimes.